So my name is Christin Monroe, and I'm going to be talking about ways to unlock chemistry learning for neurodivergent students. So I'm going to start off with some background and definitions, talk a little bit about anxiety and burnout, and then how Macmillan tools can assist with personalized learning, and then I'm going to leave you with a challenge to apply this knowledge. I want to start off with a disclaimer. I have gone to a lot of talks that talk about accessibility, and accessibility can be really intimidating. So I want you to think as we go through this that the strategies that you use have to be authentic to yourself, because if you don't own it, the students won't own it. To your content, I teach chemistry, but that doesn't mean that you can't adapt some of these concepts to your classes and also to the unique students that you serve. So just think about that. It doesn't have to be a one-for-one type of thing, or you don't have to integrate every single thing at once. It can be something that you integrate over time. I feel like I should mention that I did use ChatGPT as part of this to develop this presentation. First, I used it to create an abstract with the ideas that I had. And it's useful because you can expand it or shorten it, so expand it to the appropriate length, or adapt it. As academics, we tend to give similar presentations, and so you can say, take the specific prompt from the conference that you're submitting to and include that as well, and it will create an abstract that aligns better with the audience that you're targeting. I also asked it to create an outline once the abstract was done. I found the abstract generation really helpful. The outline was moderately helpful. One of the things that was nice about it was that it allowed me to kind of see what the expectations were of the audience, which is something that I don't always think about. Like, when people see this abstract, what are they expecting to get? So it was moderately helpful. I used it to get started, but then I kind of deviated as I started to plug in my own personal content. And then I also used it to generate a list of multiple choice questions to use with iClicker. And this took several iterations, but I think we landed on some good questions, hopefully. So I teach at Landmark College, which was established in 1985. It's in southern Vermont. You can see in this red area there. And it's the first institution of higher education to solely serve neurodivergent students. So that's something that's near and dear to my heart. When we talk about neurodiversity, some of the things that you might think about are students that are dyslexic, have ADHD, have autism, and executive function challenges. And when we talk about neurodiversity, we're really talking about the broad range of the variations in the whole human genome. So everyone in this room is part of that neurodiversity framework. When we talk about being neurodivergent, if you think about the bell curve, you're talking about students that might fall either below average for certain things or above average. It's also important to recognize that being neurodivergent can be outside of that bell curve, above average for things, on top of below average. So as I go through, just something to think about, because I think that sometimes sometimes people confuse neurodiversity with neurodivergent, so it's important to define those things clearly. Language is a very personal thing. A lot of people prefer person-first language, especially when they're talking about individuals with disabilities, but I have some students that actually prefer to use disability-first language. Neurodivergence is a cultural movement, and some individuals, it's a big part of their culture and their identity. And so it's important to recognize that that is a personal decision for individuals. And also whether or not to talk about being neurodivergent as a disability. That's something that I know that some folks will say, oh, it's not a disability. And it's also a very situational thing. Any disability is situational. A blind man is not disabled in a cave, right? So our world has been designed for the folks that lie in the middle of that bell curve. So if you fall outside of that bell curve, then you can have barriers. I also wanted to use this quote to talk a little bit about where accommodations come from, because I think that's somewhat of a black box for faculty. But really what accommodations do is when you go to a disability resource office, first and foremost, you ask, is there a disability? And then the second question is, what barriers exist as a result of that disability? And there's value for students to acknowledge the disability so that they can seek out the appropriate accommodations, so that they can eliminate those barriers. Something that I've been exploring recently is looking into masking and something called neurodivergent burnout. So masking, I recently read this book, Unmasking Autism, which gives a broad overview of some of the challenges that can happen when you mask. And they talk about how masking is a sensible survival strategy when you have no other tools at your disposal. The problem with masking is that, as you can see from this figure, there's a lot of things that are going on below the surface. And so you may think that everything is fine, and you might be tempted to say, oh, that student doesn't have a disability, but you're not seeing the underlying things. And sometimes the students that I work with, I sometimes wonder, why have they chosen to come to Landmark? Why do they need these additional supports? And sometimes when they're really good at masking, it catches me off guard when they have a problem. And it catches them off guard. And it takes us longer to catch up. Masking also taxes your working memory capacity. Currently, we can only, the literature suggests that we can only hold about 4 things in our head at the same time. So imagine that you were taking the effort to mask, intentionally or unintentionally, and you're taking away 1, 2, 3 spots in your brain, so you're not able to focus on learning because you're so focused on, quote, being normal. This is something that I want to share with folks, because I think that as we start to explore this cultural movement, it's important to recognize that as much as we want to normalize being neurodivergent, there is value in acknowledging the differences that you have in your brains as well. I mentioned executive function challenges. Landmark doesn't require a diagnosis. If you demonstrate that you struggle with executive function challenges, you're also eligible to attend the college. And so executive functions are the cognitive processes that regulate an individual's ability to sustain self-directed work. And there are many different models of executive functions, but this is a model, Brown's model, that was specifically developed to talk about students that have ADHD. What we tend to see is that students who are neurodivergent do tend to also struggle with executive function challenges. Not always, but they can struggle with that. And I'll talk about how Achieve can help to tackle some of these issues with executive function challenges in a subsequent slide. But breaking them down is really useful when you start to work with students and kind of recognize, oh, are you struggling with activation energy? I'm a chemist, I couldn't help with that. Or are you struggling with effort and managing frustration? A lot of people ask me, how do you balance all of the different individual learning needs in your classes? And I'll talk about that in subsequent slides, and also managing diverse classroom behaviors. That's something that, a lot of my students need different things and need different environments. So the use of Macmillan tools can really help to address those things. That's where we get to Macmillan tools. First, I'm going to talk about Achieve, which I've been using for the longest period of time. Just to give you a little bit of sense of what my classroom looks like. I typically teach in-person synchronous classes. So I do about a 30 to 40 minute lecture where I'll just kind of introduce a concept. But most of the time in my classes are typically an hour and a half, is independent time to work through Achieve problems. I don't assign Achieve problems outside of class intentionally because I want the students to engage with me and ask questions. And I handpick the Achieve problems that are personalized to my lessons. For homework, I tend to give interactive videos, and students obviously have the option to complete anything that they don't finish during classes, and I also have reading assignments that pair with the videos. So I really use that flipped classroom model. But in chemistry, and I think a lot of other subjects, many students struggle to master a concept until they actually do them themselves. I can stand up here and I can tell you how, 10 different ways of doing a chemistry problem, and it works perfectly, and you think you've got it, and then you try it and you're like, oh. All right. So Achieve really helps with that. So As I mentioned, there are specific ways in which Achieve tackles executive function challenges. I tend to assign Achieve during class because students need that specific dedicated academic time to overcome that activation barrier. So getting started on tasks, doing it during class significantly raises the grades in my class. Typically, my low grades tend to be around 40s or 50s, because if the student's at least showing up and doing the work during class, their content knowledge is more reflected. And the thing is that, if they have those grades, they're more likely to feel like, okay, you know what, I can put a little bit more effort in and I can bring that grade up. When you get into the 20s and the 8s, which does happen in other classes at Landmark, then you're like, oh, is there really hope there? So the self-pacing and personalized experience is great, especially for managing frustration and maintaining alertness, because the thing is that, everybody works at their own pace and everybody has different struggles. As educators, we can kind of identify the things that typically students will struggle with, but the thing is that the reality is that students will struggle with different things, and so this allows for them to go through it at their own pace. I give them unlimited attempts. These are formative assessments, so they're really opportunities for the students to explore and not truncate that learning. And the automatic grading, it tracks it as it goes. I've seen so many students work on worksheets. They're working on it. They talk to me. They've gotten the concepts down. Then they don't turn the worksheet in because they're so afraid of getting a 0 or getting a low grade and being judged instead of getting a 0. Because you know what, the 0, there's no judgment when you get a 0 because you didn't turn anything in. And so helping students overcome that anxiety is really useful. And that's something that I found really great with Achieve. There's no submit button. That's one of the hardest buttons to press. If you've ever worked with college or students applying to college and things like that, yeah, it's hard. I also have flexible deadlines. So I have a suggested deadline in line with the course content. 2 weeks after I post material, I put a placeholder 0. Students know, I tell the students all the time, all grades are fake until the midterm, so they can always go back and work on those assignments. I used to have these types of policies before I adopted Achieve, and I was spending all of my time grading. Some of my students say that Achieve doesn't sleep, so Professor Monroe can. And that is true. And then I also have a mid-semester cutoff and an end-of-semester cutoff. The mid-semester cutoff is very important because when you allow for constant remastery, at some point the student doesn't know whether to look forward or look back. And if they're so far behind, they really don't know what to focus on. And the other part of that is that if they are at the point where it's unlikely that they're able to pass a class by the middle of the semester, it's useful to be able to have those conversations with students to say, this is your real grade now. And, or, even if their grade is lower than they want, talking through those strategies. So it's good to have those times when the grades aren't real, but it's also good to have those realistic conversations. I think that, while ungrading can be useful, it can sometimes tax cognitive load and become more complicated. When you're communicating grades, you're giving the students the goalposts to shoot for, and that can be valuable, especially if you have flexibility in terms of when the students complete the content and how they work through the material. I do want to talk a little bit about iClicker. Even though I'm not pacing myself very well, it can be useful for me to pace my classes. I have gotten a lot of criticism from students before adopting Achieve that I go too fast through things. And so this allows me to pace, and I'm there for the students. So I have a lot of time at the end where students can work at their own pace. But if we want to spend more time on the lecture and they want to spend more time on the questions during the lecture, that's totally fine. I've had students that say, oh, no, wait, I need more time. Give me a few more minutes. And that's something that I respect. I'm so happy that they want to learn these things. They also can get excited about the gamification aspect. And I don't actually grade iClicker, but the students still want to respond, which I think is really cool, right? Because, a lot of times students only want to do things when it's graded, but my students like to just answer the questions and engage with that part. So I have a couple examples of iClicker questions. This one's fun because what my students end up telling me is that what happens if I'm both terrified and silly at the same time? I can't put a dot on both of those. So they like to kind of be a little clever with it. But, this is a great question to especially the mid-semester slump that a lot of us feel. We feel it, they feel it. This is a nice thing to sort of do check-ins with students. And, they don't actually have to answer it correct. There's no correct answer, but it stimulates that conversation and shows that you care. This one's fun because what ends up happening is there's some ambiguity here. Some people might say that seawater is homogeneous, and so my students end up sort of doing this deep dive into, well, it depends on what type of vegetable soup you're eating or what type of, where you are looking at the seawater. And, again, ultimately, it's not about the right answer. It's about thinking through the process. I tend to find things where I have to teach a lot of vocab to be rather boring. And so when I have these unintentional ambiguities in my questions and the students are engaging and talking about it, that's actually a really cool thing to do. And then I also do open-ended questions with math. And I say that because, some of my students are afraid of math, but the thing is, what I'll do is I'll give them the steps. So I'll typically write on the board or give them a visual of what the steps are so that they're not, even with a multi-step math problem, you're not running out of, you're not feeling like I don't even know where to get started. So I give them the starting point and then have them practice building those neural pathways of working through the problem. This is a paper that was recently published, which I found really useful. It talks about the experience for students with active learning with disabilities. And, one of the challenges with active learning is as much as it's beneficial to students, sometimes, especially students that have accommodations, it's difficult to adapt the accommodations for active learning. And one of the other challenges that happens is that disability resource offices write accommodations for sort of more traditional methods. And then when you're using new techniques, no one's prepared for it. And so, I encourage you to either talk through with your students or with your disability resource office, depending upon what guidelines you're given by your college, to help to adapt accommodations for active learning, because it's important to remember that they still need to be addressed. So a pro of active learning is that it allows for that time to be distracted. Especially for students with ADHD, it allows them, sometimes they just need to hang out with their friends for 5 minutes before they get started and chat and just kind of, get the things that are distracting them off their chest. So it allows for them to work at their own pace and to have those moments of distractibility. A couple cautions. So, if you are using iClicker to grade, extended time should be acknowledged. And sometimes that might be overlooked. But what you can do is you can give the questions to students ahead of time. If you share your PowerPoints ahead of time, you can allow and remind the students, hey, look at these ahead of time because there will be a graded component during my presentation. Another caution is that open-ended question formatting might also distract students. In chemistry, there's a lot of superscripts and subscripts and stuff like that. And so that can end up being distracting. The student is so focused on, I don't know how to put this incorrectly. Or if you show the answers, the other challenge is that they end up getting distracted by the formatting and not actually paying attention to what the correct answer is. So that's just something to pay attention to as well. So in conclusion, I talked a little bit about a very broad overview of language when talking about neurodiversity, discussed a few topics about anxiety and burnout that can happen with all students, but in particular specific to neurodivergent individuals, and then applications of Macmillan tools for neurodivergent students. When I first started at Landmark, some advice that I was given is that you don't need to move the parking lot in order to accommodate students. Sometimes moving the parking spot will make a huge difference. So as you hear all of the talks today, think about ways that you can move the parking spot and do little changes to your curriculum to make it more accessible and to improve student outcomes.